Southern Kingdom.
That's a good note.
And
More. You've got more
and
for
only
us.
2 prophets out of 16 were in the Northern Kingdom.
Okay. Before we do anything else with this, we'll fold it and we'll pray. We'll fold our hands and we'll pray, and then we'll jump into Joel. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your timeless word. It comes to us, it refreshes us, it calls us and draws us to you. Move us to find our refuge in your word and hear your promises and realize just how awesome and amazing you are. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So I have to start off with an apology to all of you. I was late, and this is put together kind of in a hastily manner. I planned on my schedule to put these things together last night, but I, in preparation for this class, I started reading a commentary that I was really enjoying, and I found myself reading it, and then I fell asleep. And then I woke up, and it was in the middle of the night, and I said I should probably go to bed. And then I woke up and I made waffles this morning, which is my responsibility, just to make breakfast for everybody. And then by the time I got that stuff done and over, I was like, I don't have enough time to put this all together. So what you have in front of you is put together in a quicker fashion than I would have liked. But we're going to talk about the rabbit that I was chasing, because I put some extra information on the back, which really, in all honesty, it does pertain to the book of Joel, but it's not important. And that's why I kind of feel bad, because it's not that important, but I found it interesting. So, but from listening to most of you, the most that you know about Joel is that Joel is Joel.
His name is Joel.
Joel. Which, do we know what Joel means?
Yeah.
Do we even go one step further?
Yahweh is God.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Someone's got their study Bible out. That's fantastic. Joel means the Lord is God, or Yahweh is God. You get that Joe, and then El at the end is God, and Yah is the shortened form for Yahweh. The questions that we're going to look at, especially this morning, and I don't know if we'll get too much of the text of Joel. There's extra stuff that we could definitely talk about with the introduction. I'll make note of some stuff that I didn't actually get on the sheet, but we'll walk through these questions together. So, introduction, who's the author of this book? We know it's Joel, right? You can read the very first verse. The word of the Lord came to Joel, son of Pethuel. Now, the next question is who is that? Now, if you look on your sheet or up on the screen, you'll see there's a ton of passages up there. And what you're going to find, I'm hoping, is that if you were to turn to every single one of these, you would find a guy named Joel. You'd find a guy named Joel. But what you wouldn't find is what you said, Marianne, which is Pethuel. The reality is we don't actually know who Joel the son of Pethuel is, which is kind of a difficult thing, because then when we go to answer the next question, when was the book written, we don't really have a good place to put him. Now, some people will suggest from extra biblical writing, so like apocryphal books and whatnot, that Joel is from the tribe of Reuben. And they do that because they kind of look at some of those extra biblical ones, and they look at some of these passages. I think if you were to go to, I think it's 1 Chronicles chapter 5, I think that's the one where it talks about the tribes of Reuben, and in there is listed this guy named Joel. But there is no connection to Joel with Pethuel. And so in this regard, there's a lot of Joels, but we don't know or don't really see Joel the son of Pethuel anywhere else in all of Scripture. So the question then is who is he? And the answer is, I don't know. I mean, I know he's Joel, and I know he lived. I know his dad or his grandfather was Pethuel, but that's all I know. Now, and that leads us to another perplexing question, which is, when was this book written? Well, there's a 400-year span 400-year span when most suggest that Joel wrote. And if you look at the attachment on the back, I know the writing's not very big, but you have one side is arguments for a late dating, which would be after the exile. And then you have an early dating or counter arguments for an early dating, which would be before the exile. And for a long time, nobody thought the prophet of Joel wrote during the exile. Well, as you can imagine, someone has suggested that as well. So, you could pick a date for when you'd want Joel to write, 800 all the way down to 400, and you could find some scholar saying, you're right. And the reality is it really doesn't matter when the book of Joel is written. We try to anchor it to certain things, and we find ourselves in positions of books that are prophets. We try as best to anchor them into the history or the timeline. Like when we were talking about Jonah, there's that passage from, I believe, 2 Kings where it talks about Jonah proclaiming something to the king, Jeroboam II. I believe that's the correct king. And so then we can kind of firmly anchor him down, Jonah, in some kind of time frame. Well, since we don't have any other Joel, son of Pethuel, guess what? There's no real anchor point there. And when you look at the book of Joel, it's going to talk about stuff like Sheila said to us. It's going to talk about places like Judah and Jerusalem. So we know that Joel was a prophet to the southern kingdom, which there wasn't as many prophets to the southern kingdom as to the northern kingdom. So we know that that's the work that he was doing and where he was prophesying. But the whole book of Joel kind of centers around these locust plagues. And we might start thinking to ourselves, well, if we could find a locust plague, then we could kind of anchor it down to that time. Well, guess what? There really isn't anything that we know of besides the plague that was sent on Egypt. So in this regard, and we would say that that's definitely not during that time period, because there's actually talk of a temple. So we know that this is after the temple has been built, and there's the people that we're going to hear about. We don't actually hear about a king either in the book of Joel, which makes it difficult, right? Because if you had a king, then you could anchor him into a timeline somewhere. During the writing of this, we have the mention of elders and priests. So it has to be at some point in time in Israel's history when elders and priests were functioning. So that could be before the exile. You could say that could be after the exile, right? Because then there's a temple, then there's elders, then there's priests. Some suggest a later exile or a later date because of the post-exilic, the notion that there's no king anymore. So then it makes sense that there is no king mentioned. However, if you were to read that table that I put in your notes, the opposite argument would be just because there isn't a king mentioned doesn't mean there isn't a king that's in operation. And there are times in the pre-exilic dates of Israel when there are things like Joash, who is kind of the leader while King Josiah is too young to rule. And so the notion is there's not much talk of a king. The thought is there's not much talk of a king because he's not really doing much. And he's just kind of waiting to get to the point where he's old enough to reign and rule. And then during that time, Joash is the one doing the reigning and ruling, and he's a priest. Right? So, if you were to, and this is just a tiny, tiny taste of the rabbit that I was chasing in the evening. But there are arguments for and arguments against. And I don't want you to think that I put this chart together, because I did not. This is from the commentary that I was reading. And it's written by a MLC professor, Thomas Nass, who was my Hebrew professor. So it was fun to listen to him read his work again. But there's a lot of arguments, as you can tell, for both. And probably the strongest argument that as I was reading, wisely, the Professor Nass, the commentator that I was reading yesterday, suggested that we're not going to pinpoint a date because there's really no way to do that. And really, quite frankly, it doesn't matter. The message of Joel is actually timeless. And as we jump into it, what we're going to see is, you're going to see, this is the prophet who actually gets to be a part of the very first sermon in the New Testament. Outside of Jesus, the early Christian church, the very first sermon that's preached is built upon Joel. Peter on the day of Pentecost, guess who he references? Joel. Paul makes reference of Joel when he talks about everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's a phrase from Joel. And so we're going to look at this book and we're going to enjoy Joel. We're not going to be able to say, here's a specific instance where we can look at and say this anchors it in a certain time. We don't need that. We don't need that. The reality is those things are secondary to the actual message of the book. Well, it might be nice for us to satisfy some desire that we have in our head to say, here's when it was written and here's why we know it was written at this time. The reality is when we look at the book, what does it say to us? That's really the main focus. Now, the other thing that's on that back page is, what about these locusts? So you got two events of locusts that are talked about in the prophet Joel. In the first chapter, it talks about them. It's right up front. And in this regard, so the notion that we have to look at is what do we do with them? Is this a real locust plague? Is this a figurative plague? What sense can we make of all this? You have all the variety of answers that you could possibly come up with in that chart on the bottom. They're both, because there's going to be two instances where you're going to see one of a locust plague and then another locust plague. And you can take that in a variety of different ways. They can either be real locust plagues, one can be a locust plague, one can be figurative, or they both can be figurative. In this regard, what we're going to do is we're going to look at it and say the first one seems to be a real locust plague, and the second one seems to be talking about something coming off in the future that's like the locust plague. So one would be real and one would be figurative. And I think, let's see here. You've got at least you've got that option in the bottom. What would be the bottom left of the corner? We'll talk more about that as we work ourselves into those locust plagues. But the first one, the very first locust plague that we're going to see is right at chapter 1. Now, I guess before we jump into the actual text of Joel, you guys have any questions that I can't answer?
How long is it going to take us to study Joel?
Not very long. It'll probably take us, because there's really only, if you look at the English, there's 3 chapters.
I think I heard that you couldn't answer.
Oh,
I was
yeah, I'm
being a
sorry.
little
Yeah.
facetious.
Well, I don't know specifically, so. Go for it.
Just looking at this quickly, why couldn't the locusts be the invaders at that time?
It could be.
That's what I would think, that it would be the invaders that have come in and taken over and killed everything.
And in this regard, you wouldn't be alone. You wouldn't be alone in that thought. I don't even know if it's in the chart.
No.
It's not in the chart. But I was going to say, in the readings that I had, there are several who suggest that both the past one and the future one are both figurative.
What it says in here, just for reference, he describes the locusts as the Lord's army and sees in their coming a reminder that the day of the Lord is near. So that's, I think that's what you're getting at, right, Elaine?
No, I was thinking of the Babylonian invasion where...
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Oh, the Lord's, okay.
Mm-hmm. And in this regard, you readily could say, yes, it's possible. The notion is that Babylonian and Assyria is not mentioned at all. And that's the difficulty. Right. Right.
But they came in and they devastated the country and and called everybody away. And
Yep. It is possible that both the locusts are figurative. 100%. You are correct. You could say that. you could say what's described in chapter 1 is a figurative way of explaining the way in which Israel is taken away. You could say that. You could rightfully say that. As I look at this and I read it, I think, at least in my mind, is to say the first one as we read through it, it seems to me in my mind to note that this is probably a real locust plague that's being referenced. And it's something that happened in the past. And the reason why I say that is because as I read through it, the notion is there's not really anything that would say this is not a real locust plague. And I'm not saying it couldn't be a figurative explanation of something that happened in the past. I'm not saying that. It could be.
So he's referring to the locust plague in Egypt that happened
He might be.
past, and this is what's going to be happening now.
He might be, or he could be just referring to a locust plague
Right.
that we
Yeah.
don't know of, which is, I mean, is a real thing.
Yeah.
And I think in this regard is, whatever you see these as, you're still actually going to be able to pull the message out. Right? You're still going to be able to understand exactly what the prophet Joel is telling the people to do. And as we kind of move forward, we are going to discuss that. Right? Please, Judy.
So how do these guys become prophets? Are they self-proclaimed or?
Excellent. There's nothing mentioned, especially about Joel, on how in the world we even get his book. In this regard, what we're going to say is, as we look at this, who picks the prophet? According to verse 1, the Lord. In this regard, that's the only answer I can give you, is that you might look at Joel and say, is this worth a read? And this first verse is going to be enough to say, yeah, it is. Because it's the word of the Lord that came to the prophet Joel. Right? So, really, Joel becomes just the conduit in which we're actually receiving this message from the Lord. Does that make sense? There isn't this notion of saying, like, who recognizes Joel as a prophet of the Lord? Right? There isn't that. One of the things that's kind of interesting when you look at the suggestion of an early date or a late date is the notion of, if this is an early date, if we date this early, which means pre-exile, it's kind of fascinating to see the other people or the other prophets that actually are kind of using some of the same language that Joel does. One of the things that I read suggests that if Joel is early, he's kind of like the prophet that everybody knows about. Because Isaiah seems to quote him, Amos seems to quote him, the books around him, where he's placed in the line of the Old Testament, right? It goes Hosea, Joel, Amos. Both Hosea and Amos seem to have similar context, and they seem to speak in similar phrases, which some suggest is a reason for an early date. Also, kind of interesting is that you get things like Micah refers to the people of Israel in the same way that Joel does. So it's kind of really interesting. And that's the rabbit I was chasing, is that depending on when you place Joel, if he's early, you could almost say he has had a tremendous impact on the rest of the Old Testament prophecy. Because Isaiah is, either he quotes Isaiah or Isaiah quotes him, right? We don't know. But it is kind of fascinating to see that all these other prophets seem to be at least picking up certain things from Joel. And that's what I fell asleep reading. Please.
So you said Southern Kingdom, right?
Yes.
So if it is early, are they, like, which tribes are Southern Kingdom? Refresh my memory that way.
Benjamin and Judah.
Judah, so, but they'd be living really close to each other, right,
Yeah,
with
yeah.
everything, so.
Some
but if
sug-
it's late, then the northern disappears and the southern is basically what
Well,
comes
if
back?
if it's late, this is a reason for a late date, is it's just referred to as Israel.
Right.
And so there is no northern and
Yeah.
southern because everything is exiled and it's brought
Right.
back. So some suggest because there is this notion of calling it Israel, and we know that it's in Jerusalem, this could be a late date.
So if it's early, would they be just the tribes at that point, or are they?
No, they still
They're a
broke
southern
themselves up
kingdom.
as northern and southern kingdoms. Absolutely.
So they each
Yep.
would have kings, right?
If it's early, they should have a king. And that's the kind of the why no mention of a king?
And we're not going even early with judges.
It wouldn't be that early because there's references to the temple.
Okay.
And shortly after the temple, what happens? After Solomon is king, he reigns, what happens? It splits. Right? So in this regard, this is the
I'm thinking big chronological.
yeah. So this is kind of the interesting thing about it is, it is interesting.
So-
You don't know exactly where he's placed. You can't anchor him down, and so when you start to look at this stuff, it's just kind of an interesting thing. It really will it change the way that you view life? No, 100% it will not. But it is kind of interesting just to think if Joel is early, he has a tremendous impact on the rest of the Old Testament prophecy, which is kind of a cool thing.
Even cool, like you say, whether they quote each other or Peter
Right.
and all that. That's
Right.
neat. I didn't.
And I think in this regard, Professor Nass, who writes the commentary that I was reading, he does not say you can't pick a date. He does suggest, though, the books as they're written, or at least put in the Old Testament, sometimes do reflect what the mind's eye was chronological order. So Hosea and Joel and Amos, that's a suggestion that they're early on. I would say a stronger argument for an earlier date, which isn't a solid argument, or isn't a confirmed argument, is the Hebrew. The Hebrew itself is a much more classical Hebrew than you get when you get to a post-exilic notion. And I mean, in my mind, that's probably the strongest argument for an earlier dating. It's not a guarantee, because it could be someone saying, "Well, I'm going to write like they used to write," and I'm gonna pull from all these prophets, which you could easily see happen. But so in that regard, like I said, we don't really know the date, but it is kind of just interesting. And what we're going to see is Joel uses these two events to communicate to the people of God something that every single Christian will need to understand and know as they live in this world. There's no question about that, and that's really the message of Joel, which is kind of neat. So maybe with all that being said, we'll jump into the text of Joel, and if we've got more questions, we can kind of pan them out or look at them as we go along. So the first section I have is this 1 through 14. Okay, and this is how it reads. The word of the Lord came to Joel, son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders. Listen, all of you who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days, or in the days of your fathers? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. What the grasshoppers have left, the swarming locusts have eaten. What the swarming locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. And what the young locusts have left, the mature locusts have eaten. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you wine drinkers, because the sweet wine that has been snatched from your mouth. A nation has come up into my land, powerful and without number. It has teeth like a lion and fangs like a lioness. It has devastated my vines and shredded my fig trees. It has completely stripped off their bark and thrown it aside, so that their branches are bare and white. Grieve like a virgin dressed in sackcloth, who grieve for the husband of her youth. Grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests are in mourning. Those who minister in the presence of the Lord, the fields are devastated. The soil mourns. The grain is devastated. The new wine has run dry. The olive oil runs out. Hang your heads, you farmers. Wail, you vine growers, for the wheat and for the barley, because the grain harvest has died in the field. The vine has dried up. The fig trees has withered. The pomegranate and date palm and the apple tree, all the trees in this country have dried up. And joy has dried up for all the people. Put on sackcloth, you priests and laymen. Wail, you who minister in front of the altar. Come spend the night in sackcloth, you who minister before my God, because the grain offerings and drink offerings are being held back from the house of your God. Set aside a day of fasting. Call a solemn convocation. Summon the elders and everyone who lives in the land to come to the house of the Lord your God. Cry out to the Lord. Okay, so that's the first part. And in this regard, we're going to say, as we've already said, though we know little about Joel, what important fact do we learn? That this message that he brings is from who? Yeah, it's from God. And there's, in this regard, you could say, this in and of itself is an important lesson for all of us to learn. That the message that we, or at least when we think about or understand or even think about what we are to listen to and follow, it doesn't come from the person who is proclaiming it, right? Why do you go to a church? Well, because pastor's really cool. That's not a good reason. It really isn't. Because pastors aren't always that cool. And even if they are, guess what? Eventually they'll be uncool. Right? So in this regard, what do we know about Joel? Really not a lot. Does that really matter? Not really. Not really. In fact, in this regard, we could say that might make it more of us enhanced to say, hey, let's really focus on the message itself. The message itself. Right? So I think even in that aspect, you could say, here is something for us that we could think about. Now, I found it kind of interesting as you read through this. It says, the question is what different groups does Joel address in chapter 1? And think about the reason for which each group might be listed. Like, why would Joel prophesy to these people? And then, which of God's blessings did the locust plague take away from them? So you have really three questions there. One, identify the group. Two, why is that group identified? And three, how are they impacted? So there's, depending on how many groups, that's times 3. So if there's 4, that's 12 questions. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, the things that are happening there are what God said would happen whenever the Israelites were going into the promised land if they didn't
Excellent.
do what he said.
Excellent.
Everything he said is
Yeah, so in one of the commentaries that I was reading, I underlined this passage, and I don't know what the passage is because I know I remember to underline it. It's on the bottom of the page. I can probably find it in a second, but you're absolutely correct. The reference that's there is I think it's from Exodus, but it's the notion of if the Israelites do not listen and do what I have said, this is then the response. And guess what? This is now the response. So good. That's a good thought. Now, what groups are we looking at then?
Farmers.
Farmers are in there for sure. What verse?
Well,
11.
I'm going on. Hang
yeah,
hang your heads, you farmers. Of course, we would pick the farmers out. Why might the farmers be listed here? And I think what's interesting is this. Depending on what translation, you have an NIV?
I do.
What does it say for the farmers to do? Does it say hang your
Despair,
heads?
you farmers, wail,
Despair.
you vine growers.
So oftentimes a translation of despair, but here actually why it says hang your heads and not of despair is because it's actually be ashamed. The Hebrew word there is be ashamed, you farmers. Which is kind of an interesting thing to say to farmers, because guess who doesn't really have a ton of control over?
Yeah.
But I think in this regard, it kind of helps us understand the whole point of the message is that what do the farmers provide? Food, and not just food, but we're going to get down into it as you keep reading down.
Wine, for sure.
Wine, yeah. Farmers are oftentimes the one who are providing not only just for themselves, but for the people. They're going to be the ones who are directly impacted. Their primary function of doing what is now removed?
Their productivity.
Yeah, their primary function of this is the only thing we expect of you, farmers. You can't even do that now. Anything else? Any other group?
Well, I put down elders, very first one. Hear this, you elders.
Yeah.
People in
This is a moment when we might expect the word king to appear, melech in the Hebrew, but guess what? We don't get that. We get elders. Those who are important in the land. Hey, think about this. You should start to wail. You should start to, and why might the elders be included?
Well, they're kind of the head of things. We're talking about the head of the household, the head of the church is head of everything, right? That's
Whenever there's an issue that impacts the people, whose should be involved? The elders or the king, however you want to look at it, right? So I would say in this regard, the notion that the elders are listed, the notion that other people are listed, this is a notion to say things are going to be very, very difficult, or they are difficult because of the things that are taking place. Debs.
And how about in verse 13, you who minister?
Yep. So another group would be those who are, yep, priests. In this regard, why would the priests put on sackcloth, or why in the world would they wail? Why would they be listed here? This, I think, is a really interesting one.
Well, I guess just the idea that they can no longer do sacrifices because there's no grain and there's no animals and there's nothing to do it with.
You think about, you have disasters that take place. The last thing that should go is, especially for God's people, is the work of the priests. But this is going to be so bad that guess what? They can't even do the normal, regular things that they are supposed to be doing.
Kind of like COVID?
Kind of like COVID, sure. In this regard, we would say maybe even worse than COVID, because their responsibility was to offer up grain offerings on a regular basis, and now what can they not do? They can't even do that. Normally, the priests are supposed to wear like these white linen robes, and now what does it call them to put on? Sackcloth. The priests are representation of the people before God, and now here the Lord calls them to put on sackcloth and to lament, to weep and to wail. I just think in that regard, this is such an interesting thing that Joel writes to these people. You think about, especially to the mindset of an Old Testament Israelite. Okay, we as New Testament believers, we don't have, offerings or sacrifices that are made. Of course, we are impacted by the physical things that take place in this world. But, you get those wonderful passages from Paul, like in Romans 8, where nothing can separate us from the love of God. But to the mind of an Israelite, if I sin, I have to make a sacrifice in order to be right before the Lord. I have to offer up sacrifices or offerings so that I can be right before the Lord. If the people of Israel don't have enough to where they can meet the regular demand of offering up things before the Lord, what does that mean? It's like the final marker, at least if I was an Israelite, to say, the Lord is not pleased with us. I mean, there's no other, I don't know how else a way to look at it. Which is why why it actually talks about, who is this from? This is from the Lord. This is from the Lord. You had your hand up, Elaine.
Well, hang your head, you farmers. All of our crops are all going to die because the illegal immigrants are being deported, so there's nobody going to be here to harvest.
In this regard, obviously a different situation. But we would say in this regard, at least for what we're talking about in Joel, I mean, I think probably the one phrase that I thought, man, this just really, in my mind, is just such an interesting picture that I think, to me, summarizes it really well. I just got to find it. Where is it?
Well, I think it is a good warning to everybody, then and now, to listen to God.
Yeah.
And they weren't.
I find this phrase to be kind of the tone setter, at least when I was studying it. Grieve like a virgin dressed in sackcloth who grieves for the husband of her youth. Meaning, this is what I've dreamt about and longed for my entire life. And before it could actually take place, I could get married and have a husband. He is taken away from me. And so instead of this wedding dress that I might put on, I put on sackcloth. And now I weep and I wail. I mean, at least for me, this is kind of like it's a really sad point, but I think it summarizes quite well what the Lord is calling His people to. This is like you've lost your future. This is like, everything that you've looked forward to is now gone. And now weep and wail over it. I think that's pretty devastating. Go for it.
What exactly is sackcloth?
So sackcloth would be like
Burlap.
it is like it's a rough burlap material, and the whole notion is that it's rough so that whenever you wear it, you are hurting. So you go to do something and it just rubs and itches and causes you to just be in misery the entire time.
Your burlap sacks are not comfortable.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
And that's the point. The point, and in this regard, it's kind of interesting, even if you want to look at that or think about that in a sense of, for us as New Testament Christians, it is just like a different mindset, because why in the world would you wear burlap, right? It's a notion to express before the Lord, we deserve to suffer for the things that we have done. And so we will put on sackcloth. And I don't know if you guys were here yet, but in Jonah, that's what the whole city of Nineveh does, and the animals do. They cause the animals to put on sackcloth, which would be very uncomfortable. And that's the notion, is to say, we are not worthy to have the things that we have, and now every aspect of our life should be one of misery. And in all honesty, you think about that as a New Testament Christian, that's what we rightfully deserve. My Wednesday sermon is in some way hits on that, right? Who do we sin against every time we sin? The Lord. And sinning against the Lord actually we should not get to have anything from Him, and yet what does He offer to us? Forgiveness and peace through Jesus. But otherwise, this is how we should spend our days, in lamenting and sackcloth and ashes, because that's where all of our works actually head, is to the grave. Go for it.
Last week's lesson in Rapid City was the thoughts of Barabbas when he's released. Did he think about he should have been the one on the cross?
Yeah.
So that's us. Do we think about we should be the ones on the cross?
Who preached last week in Rapid?
The young guy.
Himmelman?
I don't-
That's okay. What color hair did he have?
Light colored.
Light colored? It's not
Young,
Himmelman.
young and light colored.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember his name.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I just was curious. I didn't know if they rotated or not. But that's that's a really good application, isn't it? Right? I highly doubt Barabbas cared.
Right.
I think Barabbas was like,
Woo!
what? Are you
I get it.
kidding me? I just struck
get
the
to go.
lottery. Which I think probably would be to give us too much credence to say we're like Barabbas in that way, because then there's an actual reflection upon what should have been coming to him.
Well,
Yeah,
that's.
yeah, I know.
We all deserve what Jesus
Yeah,
got.
absolutely,
and
yep.
that's- So we should have been the ones on the cross. like
Absolutely.
Barabbas should have been the one.
Yep. I think in that regard, 100%. Yep. Any other lists of people that are there?
I got drunkards.
Very good. You should have drunkards.
Yeah,
Why in the world would the drunkards be there?
because they're gonna lose their wine.
Well,
I mean,
The farmers are
it's
gonna
you're not wrong.
but
I mean,
they spent all this time not paying attention to what they should be doing.
Right.
They're focused on their wine.
Yeah, they're satisfying their own desires.
Absolutely, right? So in this regard, it's kind of interesting too, especially when you think about the order in which they're mentioned. I mean, it's just kind of an interesting thing if you think about it, right? What group do you get first?
Elders.
You get the elders to essentially say, here, there's a real problem amongst you.
Politicians.
Yeah, there's a real problem amongst you people. There's a real problem. And then you go down and then it's the drunkards to essentially say, hey, this way of living that is now going to be taken away from you. Is now going to be taken away from you. And then, as you keep going forward, then you get all these other people, right? You get the farmers who are in the field. You get the ones who are ministering. You get the impact of this disaster as it kind of just works through all of the people. And the whole like kind of thought then is, this is something that should cause you to lament and to weep and to cry. And as you think about that, I kind of thought this was an interesting, this is thoughts that I was having. How does this first section of Joel help us think about the relationship between the physical and spiritual world, and how does this impact our ministry? You think about, and it's different for Old Testament believers, I understand that, but I think we can understand how the physical and the spiritual world can interact or relate to one another, especially as we live our lives. What's going on in this section of Joel?
Physical world is falling apart.
The physical world is falling apart. The things that they probably were just counting on as like, well, we're gonna have this.
Take it for granted is what
Yeah.
we do.
Mm-hmm. And then, what's the result then?
And you turn to the Lord for help. I mean, I think you mentioned that too about, last week when things get bad in our life, which we always take for granted, that's when it draws us back into the Lord's. And that's why He gives us these problems, some of these things.
Yeah, the
You're
notion of
straying away.
the notion of suffering, and it's placed in the life of a believer. I don't know if the average Christian thinks about that enough. I mean, the reality is this world is full of suffering. It really is. And in this regard, you can really find yourself in one of two camps. You can either say, and I think there's a little bit of both. I mean, like when you look at the reality of living in this world, yes, there is a part that just says this is the marker of sin. We live in a world full of sin, and so then there is suffering and sorrow that's attached with just living in this world. And then I would say, then the following thing that you would say, or you could say, then is what Paul kind of says in Romans, is that then this suffering actually God uses for our benefit, because it produces this wonderful character. And I would even say some of those things that we face in our life, you might say, how does this mold and shape me for something better, or how to be a better witness or whatever. And I mean, as I was preparing for last Sunday's sermon, you finally get to the point of maybe it doesn't. Like maybe there's not a point in your life where you can be like looking back and be like, oh, I went through that trial because now I'm more equipped to serve in this capacity. Maybe the point of suffering is just to know suffering. Maybe the point of suffering is to say, I have a Lord who suffered, and when I suffer, I have to reflect upon the suffering He had. And so suffering in and of itself is just a tool that God can use to cause me just to reflect on the love that God had for me in the suffering that He endured. And then I would say, if you come to that point, if you say, I don't know if this is worth anything, but it certainly sucks, you can then say, man, Jesus went through that. Willingly went through that. I would never, but Jesus did.
For me.
For me. And so now I get to see more clearly my Savior and His desire and His love for me. And then I move forward saying, okay, yeah, I'm going to suffer. But my Lord suffered. So that's what I expect from this world. And that, I don't know how many people I sit there, I say, like, I don't know what the future holds for any of you. Your future could really stink from the eyes of the Lord. It really could. And in that regard, it's not like the Lord abandons us. He doesn't. I would say that's where faith works its way into the conversation. Man, it's easy to say, oh, I love the Lord. I trusted Him always when you've got a full refrigerator and you got wine to drink. And I'm just using people from Joel, not talking about you. But then when all that's taken away, where do you go?
Romans 8:28.
Romans 8:28. You turn yourself to the Lord, right? And that's the mindset and the attitude of a believer, is to run to the Lord actually always. And suffering, I think, helps us understand that probably more than anything else. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, it still makes it hard to understand why people like the Spiegelbergs have to go through so much with their daughter.
Right? 100%. 100%. And I would say in this regard, no one has been promised anything.
Right.
And in that regard, it's not to say that doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying in this sense is, if you really take an account of the way in which the Lord has blessed you, I think in this regard, you find yourself, if you really actually take a serious look at it, you find yourself saying, Lord, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve the things that I have. I don't deserve the position that I'm in. And how often do we find ourselves then saying, I don't want to be in this position. I don't want to have the situations that are in front of me. And yet, when we really stop and say, Lord, this is the way you've treated me, do we find ourselves saying, forgive me, forgive me. It doesn't mean that, the things that take place in this life don't matter, or they don't hurt, or there isn't real sorrow and suffering that takes place in this world, because it absolutely does.
But everybody's waiting for that aha moment when things are better. And
yeah, they might not. They might not come.
right.
They might not come. And in that sense, I would say they will, but maybe not in this world. I mean, right? If earth was so great, who'd want to go to heaven?
So the only thing the Lord's ever promised us is heaven.
Right.
That is it.
Right. And I mean, in that regard, that's why it's called hope. Right. That's why there's hope there. Otherwise, you'd be like every country singer. This place is so great. I don't ever want to leave it. I want to go to heaven, but not right now. Are you kidding me? That's an actual country song. I think to myself, you must not understand heaven. But that's the mentality of this world, right? God has blessed us so much that we look at this world of suffering and sorrow and say, I'd kind of like to stay here.
No way.
No way.
But I mean, like, there are people out there who that's the mentality. Well, then you don't really fully understand what God has waiting for you. You don't. And I think Joel, as he talks about this, I mean, there's no doubt that Joel is saying the situation you find yourself in is one of devastation. And that physical devastation actually has an impact spiritually on the lives of the people, because they're not able to carry out the spiritual act of, offering sacrifices and stuff. And I think for us, that's helpful, at least when we try to do ministry with people, especially people we don't know, that they might struggle with just the things that you're talking about. They might have a whole lot of stuff going on in their life. Their physical, like the physical realm in their life might just be beating them up. So in that regard, there might be a lot of resentment and anger directed towards the Lord because they don't fully understand who He is. And I think in that regard, then, for us, it might cause us to say, I'm going to be gracious with you. I'm going to be gracious with you. And I'm going to be patient with you. And I'm going to try to minister to you the way in which God would minister to me. And is doing with you, but maybe you don't understand that. I don't know if that's helpful or not. All right. Any other thoughts or questions on that? This one seems kind of simple, but it's so important. What does Joel call on the people of Judah to do in response to the plague?
Cry out to him.
Cry out to the Lord. Boy, this kind of, I mean, obviously it fits right into what we've just been talking about. How does this encouragement from the prophet act as an excellent reminder for us? Obviously, it's a great reminder for us. But I think in the sense is, you said that in reference to the sermon on Sunday. I think, one's prayer life oftentimes can indicate that. It can indicate that during a time of suffering, our prayer life increases usually. At least I feel like that's the case for me, and I'm guessing a lot of other people. When we really can't fully contemplate or work through the things that we've got going on this earth, what do? We open ourselves up to the Lord and ask Him to help us. Paul says, in the New Testament, he doesn't just say, pray when you got problems. However, though, sometimes in this life, that can be the practice of some Christians, is I'm just going to pray to God when I've got problems. And that's not what God wants from us. He says, pray continuously, pray always. As we live our life, I mean, it's not a bad thing to... My kids sometimes catch me doing this. I'm talking to myself, but I talk to the Lord, but I talk to the Lord out loud sometimes. And so my kids are like, Dad, you're talking to yourself. And I go, well, not really. I mean, but it looks like that, but not really. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing.
Our Friday Bible study was, how often do you compliment the Lord?
Yeah. That's a really good question. Yeah. I thought he did a good job with breakfast today. I had a hand in it, but he did a good job with breakfast today. Everything rose and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I got a shirt that says, of course I talk to myself. Sometimes I need expert advice.
I don't know if I'd feel comfortable wearing that shirt, but if you do, that's good. That's good. No, right, 100%. Yeah.
My uncle always said, whenever you're talking to yourself, you're talking to a smart guy.
Sounds like he's the inventor of a shirt.
What's that?
I said it sounds like he's the inventor of that shirt, or at least the thought behind it. I would like to look at the prayer maybe in a little bit more depth than what I have time to do, and I feel like this is a good cutoff. Anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far, the first 14 verses of Joel, and really the background of the author and the setting, which we really don't know? If not, we'll pray and then you guys can be on your way. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for the wonderful blessings that you give to us. We also thank you for the suffering that's in our lives. Move us to have a better understanding of it. Move us to understand it in the light of what you've said suffering is, which is discipline. The Lord disciplines those he loves. He treats us as sons if he disciplines us, and move us to see it that way, to help us understand that our life will be filled with that. And when it's not, we thank you for giving us the wonderful blessings you have, but also know that living in this world we can't escape it. So move us to see that and to find joy in the fact that you are there, that you love us, that you were willing to endure so much for us. Move us to just always open ourselves up to you in good times and in times of sorrow and suffering. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Pastor?
Yeah.
I just have a comment that as I was listening to your prayer, it reminded me of Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 9, where it tells us to rejoice in the Lord always and to give thanks
Well,
I will
for
say it
everything.
again. Yeah.
For everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Including the tough times.
Right.
More than usual,
Wow.
or
Right, when Paul says, hey, remove this from me. What does the Lord say? My power is made perfect in weakness, my grace is sufficient.
all I can say is these first 14 verses, they're not very uplifting. You wouldn't want to go there and
Jen had spoken with Jason this
until you know
morning.
the